and the atom separate, the unique properties of the water molecule do not go anywhere. They simply vanish, for the organization of matter and energy from which they arose is no longer present. This is equally true, according to scientific materialism, of the emergent property of awareness, human or otherwise. When the neurosystem ceases functioning, materialists say, awareness disappears without a trace. The implications of this view concerning the nature of death are clear. Individual awareness vanishes, and only a decomposing configuration of matter and energy remain. So with this theory of mind, that the mind is an emergent property of the neurosystem, particularly the brain, then we can say that, according to this theory, at the beginning of this life, when the brain neurosystem started functioning, then we have the emergent property of awareness or consciousness or mind coming into existence. And at the end of the life, when the neurosystem and brain stops functioning, then that emergent property of mind, consciousness and awareness ceases to exist. So this is the implication of this view of the mind. So that is very simply the scientific materialist theory of mind. Of course, there are many theories of mind. That's just one, and I'd like to compare that with the Buddhist theory of mind now.
I think what she said is that the mind is not explained by science, that there are just a few requirements, but they don't know what makes the required factors are named, but not sufficient factors to create the mind.
Yeah.
So they have this bloop and then mind.
Yeah. Of course, in this theory, then a lot of these things, when you ask, they can't really explain. So I think this sort of theory, even though it fits well with scientific materialism, there are a lot of open questions, as you said. And so if you probe into this theory and ask these questions, then often you come up with a blank, no answer, because the theory still has a lot of holes in it. So, and there are many theories which sound nice, and then when you question it, then you go, well, how do you explain that? And they go, well, I'm not sure. So, yes, that's true. Okay, so let's now have a look at the Buddhist theory of mind. And I'd like to start by briefly presenting a simple definition of mind according to Buddhism. So often you'll see in Buddhism a definition of mind as the mind is that which is clear and knowing. Sometimes it's translated as has clarity and awareness. In this two-word definition, the first word is describing the entity of the mind itself. And the second word is describing the function. What does it do? For example, the simple definition of fire is hot and burning. So what is the entity of fire? What is its nature? Is heat. What does fire do? It burns. So what is the entity of the mind? The nature of the mind is that the mind is clear or has clarity. What does the mind do? It knows, it is aware. Let's look at those two words in a little bit more detail. What does it mean for the mind to be clear or have clarity? This implies at least two things. One, the mind being clear or having clarity implies that the mind is not physical. So the mind is not the brain, it's not an emergent property of the brain. So within Buddhism, the mind cannot be reduced to the brain. The mind and the brain, of course, have a very close relationship. The mind can affect the brain can affect the mind. You know, if we have certain thoughts that, like when we're angry, that creates a lot of physiological change in the body. And of course, if we introduce drugs and alcohol into the body, that has a big impact on the mind. So they're very closely related, but they're not the same thing. So therefore, this is quite a big difference between scientific materialism and Buddhism. Scientific materialism says everything in the known universe can be explained in terms of matter and energy. So everything is physical. Whereas in Buddhism, there are two types of phenomena in the world, physical and mental. Mental phenomena is the mind. So the mind has no physical properties. Which means, since it's not physical, it has no spatial location. Which means the mind is not here. The brain is definitely here. And the mind is associated with the brain, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're in the same place. So that's one of the implications of the Buddhist theory of mind. What does the mind do? What is its function? It's to know... Oh, sorry, one more point about clear or clarity. So the word clear or clarity first implies the mind is not physical, it's mental. The second meaning of the word clear or clarity is because the entity of the mind is clear or has clarity, it means the mind allows things to appear in it. A little bit like the idea of a mirror. Because the mirror is clear, reflections can appear in it. Because the mind is clear, thoughts, emotions, memories, mental images can appear in the mind. But then what does the mind do? It knows, it is aware. So the mind engages in these appearances. The mind knows or is aware of thoughts, mental images, memories, and so forth. So this is a very simple definition of mind in Buddhism. And to look at that in a little bit more detail before we break for lunch, I'd like to introduce a couple more presentations of the mind, very briefly. But before I do that, is there any question about this definition? Yeah.
What do you mean by clear?
Again, clear, the implication too is that it's not physical. And the other implication that is clear, it means things can appear in it. Thoughts, emotions, memories can appear in it. So that's what the word clear or has clarity implies. That's what it means. Right, so 3 short presentations of mind to understand mind a little bit more broadly. We can look at the mind in terms of the objects that we experience with the mind. Now, of course, we can experience the 5 sense objects. We can experience visual objects. We can experience sounds, smells, tastes, and tactile sensations. The 5 sense objects. But also, we can experience mental objects, such as thoughts, emotions, and memories. So therefore, now we can experience 6 types of objects, the 5 sense objects and mental objects. And so since we can experience 6 types of objects with our mind, we can talk about what's called the 6 consciousnesses. So we can talk about the 5 sense consciousnesses and the mental consciousness. So here in the 5 sense consciousnesses, for example, the visual consciousness is that aspect of the mind that can engage with visual objects. The auditory consciousness is that aspect of the mind that engages in sounds and so forth. And the mental consciousness is that aspect of the mind that engages in mental objects, thoughts, emotions, memories, and so on. Of course, we're not saying we have 6 minds. We have one mind. And within that one mind, we can talk about these 6 aspects, the 6 consciousnesses, because we can experience 6 types of objects. Any questions? Yeah.
So, are we identifying ourselves as the mind from this?
This is something maybe I'll leave till later.
Okay.
It'll come up later. But the short answer is that we wrongly identify ourselves as many things. One of them is we identify ourselves with our mind. Why that's wrong and creates problems I'm going to look at. But also, of course, we identify ourselves with this, the body. So these are, of course, the 2 most common things we identify as me.
So are you saying me is neither of those? It's not our mind or our body?
Yeah.
Okay.
The very short answer again, to maybe just think about it a bit, is either we are the body and the mind, or we have a body and mind. You can't be something and have it. So, do we have a body, or are we the body?
So
Do we have a mind, or are we the mind? I think we have a body and mind, which means we can't be the body and mind. But more than that is coming later.
So consciousness, we ourselves are not conscious.
No.
Okay.
No.
Thank you.
The difference between consciousness and mind, because you say knowing. One part of the mind is knowing.
Yeah.
It's consciousness. Mind is consciousness, no? So what's the difference?
Again, here, in general, when we speak generally, we can say mind, consciousness, awareness, same. Here, when we use the word consciousness more specifically, we're talking about 6 types of mind, the 6 consciousnesses. So here, in a very specific context, the word consciousness takes on a little bit slightly different meaning. But when we speak very generally, then mind and consciousness and awareness mean the same thing. So that's why we have to be careful when we see the word mind, consciousness, and awareness and see how is that person using that word. Otherwise, there's a lot of confusion.
Because it's the side of the 6th sense, you don't have anything more in the mind.
No,
Am I right?
no, that's correct, yeah.
One last.
Yeah.
So yesterday, you in the meditation, you were talking about being aware. So that's that's how it's differentiated. So you're not awareness, you're more connected to the awareness of being aware.
So being aware of being aware,
Right.
awareness there is mind, and being aware is the function. To know that you're aware.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay, second presentation. We can look at the mind in terms of how the mind functions in each one of our experiences. And here, when we talk about how the mind functions in our experiences, the presentation often here is we divide the mind into 2. We have what's called main mind and mental factors. Main mind, in our experience, is simply contacting the raw object itself, experiencing the raw object itself. Then the mental factors are all the various factors in our mind which sort of fills in the experience, which will determine what type of experience we're having of the object. And in the mental factors, we can come up with a list of many. But again, in Buddhist psychology, often here we have a list of 52 mental factors, or 51, sorry. And in this list of 51, and I'm not going to go through the list, just pick out a few, 26 of them are those 26 mental afflictions, the 6 root ones and the 20 secondary ones. So more than half of the mental factors are mental afflictions, which seems to indicate that in our experience, often we have a lot of difficulties, a lot of problems, because we have a lot of these mental afflictions operating in our experiences. Then, a couple others that are important that I'll just briefly mention now. Another one that is very important here is feeling. And I think this came up earlier. This mental factor of feeling in Buddhism, the word feeling doesn't mean emotion. Here, this mental factor of feeling is talking about simply experiencing things as either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. That's it. So when you see the word feeling in Buddhism, it simply means experiencing things as either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. The reason this gets a lot of attention in Buddhism is this often leads to a lot of problems in our life. Because what do we do when we have a pleasant experience, a pleasant feeling?
We
Attach. What do we do when we have an unpleasant feeling? Aversion. Usually a big mess. We react. So that's why this feeling gets a lot of focus in Buddhism. Another mental factor that gets a lot of attention, of course, is mindfulness. Our ability to focus on the object without becoming distracted. Because if we want to really transform our mind, we need to strengthen this mental factor of mindfulness. And there are many other mental factors here, and these determine what type of experience we have of the object. This is a whole topic in Buddhism itself called Lo-Rig, Minds and Awarenesses. It's a very large area of study. So you can spend a lot of time looking at this, and then from this you can better appreciate how our mind is functioning, or how our mind is dysfunctional, actually. That's all I wanted to mention on that. Any question?
So what's the main mind?
So main mind is the aspect of the mind that simply contacts the raw object itself.
For example?
Well, anything. Like when we look at the pen, we experience the pen. The main mind is simply the aspect of experience which contacts the pen.
The seeing of it or the touch?
The experience of
The
it.
experience of it.
The raw experience. Then the mental factors fill in the experience. So the main mind, we contact the pen, and then maybe in the mental factors we have a pleasant feeling. And maybe because of that, one of the mental factors that comes up is craving and attachment. Or maybe some anger comes up. And so that colours our experience, these mental factors.
And in the feeling of being pleasant and unpleasant, what's the neutral part?
Just means neither pleasant nor unpleasant.
Okay.
That's all. Okay. Last presentation, and then we'll break for lunch. Yeah.
Sorry, can I
Sure.
About the main mind.
Yeah.
Is it also people or
No.
is it
So-
yeah.
So these two things are just a way of dividing the mind up. So these are not separate. You can't have this separately from this.
No, I understand that.
Yeah.
I'm just asking about the main mind. If the objects can be also people.
Oh
or
yeah, of course.
situations.
Oh, objects, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
In terms of objects, yeah, it can be people, of course.
So I'm not sure what's the difference between main mind and
The six consciousnesses. In every one of our experiences, whether we're experiencing some sense object or mental object, we have main mind and mental factors present. For example, here we have visual consciousness, which is responsible for seeing visual. So when we see the actual physical object pen, that's the visual consciousness operating. In that experience of the pen, we have the main mind, which is just contacting the raw object, and then the mental factors filling in the type of experience. Or, if we're talking about mental consciousness, and the object is a memory, the main mind is simply experiencing the raw memory, and then all the mental factors fill in what type of experience we have of that memory.
and another question. Sorry.
Forgotten?
Yeah.
So the last presentation we can talk about the mind in terms of different levels. And generally here in Buddhism we come up with 3 levels. We come up with what's called coarse, subtle, and very subtle. So subtle and very subtle are deeper levels of our mind. The coarse mind is the mind that is active now throughout the day, our coarse mind. And within the coarse mind, we can also have levels of coarse mind. Often I think in psychology we talk about conscious and subconscious or unconscious. So then we have a threshold. We're aware of this, and this is below the level of our awareness. But whether it's conscious or subconscious or unconscious, from a Buddhist perspective, all of that is within the coarse level of mind. Whether it's conscious or subconscious, that's all coarse. In Buddhism, we have 2 much more subtle level of mind, subtle and very subtle mind, which, how they're described, I think, are not even known to exist in psychology. Because this coarse mind is the mind that is associated with the brain. Whereas the subtle and very subtle levels of mind are levels of mind that do not depend on the brain. And they are, from a Buddhist perspective, each level of the mind has a corresponding physical element, physical support. So the coarse mind is supported on the coarse body, this brain, this nervous system. The subtle body, the subtle mind is connected and supported by subtle body, which of course is all the subtle energies flowing in what's called the channels, and then we talk about chakras and so forth. So many systems talk about this subtle body. And then the very subtle mind is associated with a very subtle wind energy. Now, the reason we introduce this presentation of mind is that the deeper level of the mind that we can gain access to, the more stable, the more powerful. So here, now, we are working with our coarse mind. And our threshold usually is sort of up here somewhere. So there's a lot of, and because it's up here, our mind is not very well trained. It's a lot of agitation, a lot of dullness, a lot of unbalance. If we do the stabilizing meditation, the shamatha practice that we looked at briefly last night, what we're effectively doing is bringing that threshold down a long way. Meaning a lot of these subconscious or unconscious mental events become conscious and our mind becomes more stable, more focused, more clear. So the goal is to train the mind so that we have a lower threshold and that our mind becomes more stable and clear as a basis for the spiritual path. So that's normally what we talk about in terms of the shamatha practice. But beneath that, we have these two other levels that normally we don't have access to. And that only in very high levels of Buddhist practice that come in the area of Tantra or Vajrayana do we have methods available to gain access to these levels of mind. And if we can gain access to these levels of mind, they're much more powerful. And if we can gain access to these levels of mind and use them in our other practices such as Vipassana and so forth, we can accelerate the spiritual path. So this is the whole idea of what's called Tantra or Vajrayana, is to gain access to these levels of mind and use those in the spiritual path. So that's very briefly, quickly, presentation in terms of levels of mind. Any questions about that before we break for lunch? Yeah.
I have this experience sometimes when I'm talking to someone and then I have this sort of an insight which is expressed with like chills down my spine. Is that something, I don't know, is that
sort of
am
insight?
I enlightened?
Sort of insight. What when you say sort of insight?
Well, they talk.
Like an insight into that person's behaviour, or
I certainly see the whole picture.
you see? Okay. I mean, it's difficult to know what you're experiencing, but one thing that can happen, and this can happen not just in that case, but often when we're faced with strong stimulus. See, what we're going to see later is that we distort reality because we perceive reality, but then what we do with our conceptual mind is we project a lot of stuff on what we experience on top. So our conceptual mind often distorts a lot. And what can happen, I'm not suggesting this is what's, but it often happens, is that sometimes this conceptual overlay, this conceptual mind goes quiet. And that often happens when we're faced with some strong stimulus. The conceptual mind sort of drops a bit. For example, walking in nature, and then we have some very strong experience of nature with the senses, you know, the visual, maybe sound, the smell, all of these things dominate. And our conceptual mind for a minute goes dormant because of that. And what can happen then is that we can then reduce this conceptual overlay, this sort of distortion factor, and then we can see very clearly with a very calm, focused mind, we can start to see things more directly and accurately. And then we can get some insight. Particularly in that nature experience, often people have this sense of oneness. You know, there was not even a sense of me, there was just the experience. And that can happen a lot because of the stimulus being so strong, causing the mental consciousness, this distortion factor, to drop away temporarily. And we're just faced with the direct experience, the sensory experience. And then we can get some sort of intuitive insight. So that's something that can happen. I don't know if that's...
I'll think about it. I know.
To reach nirvana or enlightenment, it means to go to the subtle, the very subtle level?
Not necessarily. Well, it depends who you talk to. Because in most Buddhist traditions, you know, in the Theravada traditions and the Mahayana traditions, when we talk about stabilizing meditation and so forth, we're really talking about training the coarse mind. So in most of the Buddhist traditions, there's no mention of this at all. And so simply by training this, we can achieve enlightenment. But then when we go into the highest level of practice called Tantra Vajrayana, which sort of in its fully developed form only really exists within Tibetan Buddhism still, there they basically say, yeah, it's good to train this and you can really make a lot of progress, but to really overcome all of your mental afflictions and what's underneath, you really need to come down here, because this is not really powerful enough to take you the whole way. Yes, you can make good progress with this, but at some point, this is what the Vajrayana people say, you'll need to gain access to this to complete the job. But of course, if we've done all that work and we've gone that far, then at that point to get to this level is not that difficult. I mean, now for us it's super difficult to get here, but if we've done all of this work and gone quite a way on the spiritual path, then to shift into this Tantra Vajrayana mode is not that difficult at that point.
Like, what happens there if we can reach enlightenment at the forest?
Well, according to Vajrayana people, you can't.
You can't, okay.
Yeah. According to the other traditions, they don't even talk about that. So from their perspective, yeah, of course we can achieve enlightenment, because that's all you've got to work with. Okay, 12 o'clock, it's lunchtime, so let's break for lunch. And then this afternoon we'll come back and look at the second noble truth. We'll start to look at mental afflictions and how they operate. Actually for that, this afternoon, we're going to be using these handouts from time to time, so maybe you can grab one now and you can have a little bit of a look at them. Particularly, we're going to be using this one this afternoon, so if you want to have a bit of a look at that now, then bring them this afternoon and we'll start using them.